Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming June of 2017 regional auction. And today we're going to take a look at a pair of Warner Infallible pistols. How's that for optimistic naming? This is a 32 caliber, or these are both, 32 caliber semi-automatic pistols. These were designed and manufactured here in the US right around World War I. And the most notable thing about them may be that they can actually stand up without the use of gun stands, which is pretty cool. Anyway, these were designed by a guy whose name I can't pronounce. It's going to be something like Andrew Fyrberg, F-Y-R-B-E-R-G. And despite me not being able to pronounce his name, he actually is one of the more significant and generally completely unrecognized firearms designers in the US around this time period, around the turn of the century. He has a total of 38 firearms patents to his name, which is quite a significant number. That's about a third as many as John Browning, and really nobody has more than John Browning. Fyrberg, I just don't know how you pronounce that, but he did work for a number of companies. What he tended to do, it appears, was patent ideas, and then he would sell the patents to firearms manufacturers, which was a pretty common thing at the time for inventors. His most significant patent is probably one that was assigned to the Iver Johnson company, the safety for their revolvers, the safety that was behind their entire campaign, their marketing slogan of "Hammer the Hammer," the idea that no matter how hard you strike the back of the hammer of their revolver, it won't slip forward and fire. Well, that was this guy's patent. He also assigned patents and did work for, well, not just Iver Johnson, but Harrington and Richardson, Forehand and Wadsworth, CS Shattuck, and probably a number of other companies, and the Warner Arms Corporation. The Warner Arms Company was founded in about 1911, and it initially appears to have been founded as an import company to bring into the country in 1908 Schwarzlose blow-forward automatic pistols that were being made in Austria. They're a really cool pistol. We have a separate video on those, and you should definitely check that out. Those pistols, the idea was to sell them here in the US. They're a very compact little 32 automatic, and while they're an odd design, they're not necessarily that bad of a gun. And Franklin Warner decided that he'd import them and sell them here because in addition to his work in guns, he was also the president and director, or basically the guy running a company called the Kirtland Sporting Goods Company, which was in New York City, and it was a fairly significant retailer of all manner of sporting goods, and that included guns back then, as it still does today. Now, he brought in some of these Schwarzlose pistols and started to resell them, and you'll find them marked with his company's name. And then in about 1910, Schwarzlose basically went out of business, and they wholesaled off all of their remaining stock of pistols. And Warner decided to buy a whole bunch of the guns and also, apparently, the tooling to manufacture them. And his plan, I think, was to manufacture the guns here and continue to sell them, probably with the idea of having a better profit margin. Well, that didn't work out all that well, because the 1908 Schwarzlose just wasn't that popular of a gun. It was a little too weird and a little too goofy, and it may have been priced a little too high. And what Warner ended up doing was, around 1914, introduced this pistol to supplement his business. And these were advertised through the Kirtland Sporting Goods Company, and I'm sure he would have been quite happy to sell them to other retailers as well, although I don't know that anyone else actually bought a really significant number. What's interesting about this is he clearly used some of the tooling from the Schwarzlose pistols, in particular the grips. We'll see that in a moment. They're literally leftover grips from the 1908 blow forward fitted onto these Infallible pistols. So he had some of the tooling from that pistol. He got the design from Andrew, whose name I can't pronounce, and came up with this thing. It's still a 32 automatic. It's a much more conventional design. It is a blowback design. But Infallible probably wasn't the most realistic name he could have given them. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at these. We'll pull apart one of them and you can see how it works and why it might not have the best reputation today. So here we have the two different major mechanical patterns of the gun, a first type and a second type. There were more variations throughout production, but we're going to stick to the major mechanical stuff. In total, these were introduced in 1914, and then the Warner Arms Company merged with Davis & Sons, which was a shotgun manufacturing company, a relatively small one. They merged to form the Davis-Warner Company in about 1917 and continued to produce Infallibles until about 1921. The guns would remain listed in the catalog of the Kirtland Sporting Goods Company until 1924, and at that point, pretty much all trace of them disappears. Here we have one of the very first slide legends. There were a total of 4 variants of slide markings on these guns. All of them identify the gun as the Infallible. And this first pattern is specifically a Warner Arms Corporation marking. After the merger with Davis & Sons, it became the Davis-Warner Arms Corporation, and so you'll see that change up there. And it would eventually go back to just Warner after the partnership broke up. Now, I have here the early Infallible and one of the 1908 Schwarzlose blow-forwards, and there are 2 really serious similarities, and one of them jumps right out, and that is grip panels. The early production of the Infallible literally used leftover Schwarzlose grip panels. These are, as you can see, engraved with this WAC, that's Warner Arms Corporation, which was not used. This is a grip panel that was designed specifically by Warner or made for Warner. The original Austrian production guns don't have that logo in them. But he had leftovers, so they pretty much just drop in on this side of the gun. You'll notice that the grip panel doesn't really quite follow the contour of the grip, and that's because these were just available. On the opposite side, there was a little bit more work that went into them. The magazine release for the early Infallibles is down here, so Warner had to drill a hole in the grips and then make some relief cuts for the top and for the safety lever here. Then the other thing that jumps out, at least to me, is much more of a stylistic thing, and that is this very thin front rib and front sight, which that design is very similar on both of these guns. In fact, the rear sight is as well. The rear sights here are just little tiny notches cut in the rear of the frames. So you get the same sight picture on both of these guns, which is kind of like no sight picture at all. So that's the similarity with the early 1908 imported pistols. Now let's take a closer look at the Infallible itself. This is a blowback 32 caliber, 32 ACP. Ejection port there, trigger, all of the controls are on this side. Our magazine release is down here. You got a 7-round magazine with 6 viewing holes in the front and a couple 4 viewing holes / notches in the back of the magazine. And interestingly, unlike most designs, you can't just push the magazine in. You actually have to depress the button when you get the magazine started in order to put it into the gun. This lever is the safety. So rear is safe, and when you push it forward, that's the fire position. This button is for the bolt release, and this is for disassembly, so we'll get to those in a moment. In terms of overall handling, this thing is top-heavy, bulky, and awkward. The grips are a little bit too short, but the top of the gun is substantially too tall. I think this is due in large part to the fact that this actually had a cast, either iron or mild steel frame. And that's why you'll generally see these with a much different finish on the barrel than on the frame. We can see that much more clearly on this late pattern gun. The materials were different. The barrel was made out of a much better steel, and it took the finish differently. Until the very end of production, the last type of these, the whole gun was blued. But on most of the earlier ones, the frame would have been completely case hardened. That's unfortunately worn off on both of these examples, but that's why it looks different. Anyway, with a cast frame, you've got a lot of bulk up here that's just kind of a result of the casting process, rather than, a machined frame could have been made much smaller effectively, but they didn't do that. So the safety actually does drop fairly nicely under your thumb, assuming that you're right-handed. So that's nice. Sights are very small, and apparently these tend to recoil more harshly than one would expect, and that's because the bolt itself is pretty light and the recoil springs are a little bit on the light side as well. Now, to disassemble this, we're going to, and this is the early model, we're going to take this lever and rotate it 180 degrees. That actually allows us to disconnect the bolt itself from the recoil springs. Next, I'm going to push the disassembly button here, which allows the bolt stop right there to drop down. Until I pull that, it won't come down. So push that button in, and then I can pull the bolt out. I'm going to pull the trigger. Let's get that down again. There we go. So this is the bolt assembly. So we have two captive recoil springs and guide rods right here. They each will cycle backwards. Those guide rods fit into these two holes in the top of the bolt, and then they lock in place like so. And that locks the bolt into the assembly. Now, one of the potential problems with this gun is that that's not that hard to bump out of alignment. And if you should accidentally flip that lever while you're shooting, the recoil springs come, well, they disconnect from the bolt. And if that happens, the only thing that prevents the bolt from flying out and hitting you in the face is this little bolt stop right there. Now, I have a little bit of experience with a Ross rifle that I deliberately set up to fire out of battery. And I suspect, just based on that and engineering in general, I think this would probably hold the bolt, at least for the first time that it fired and tried to zoom out of the gun. I think that stop would probably be enough to keep the bolt in the gun and prevent it from hurting anybody. But obviously this was a concern to Warner because not many of these early model pistols were made before they redesigned the gun and changed the system. So on the later pattern guns here, now there's a pin that you have to actually drive out of the bolt assembly in order to do this, to take the bolt out. The design is the same. It's just instead of having a quick release lever like this, he replaced it with a solid pin. So whether this was actually, practically speaking, dangerous is kind of irrelevant. It was clearly seen as being dangerous, and it was a hindrance to selling the pistols. Other than that feature, this is a fairly typical striker-fired semi-auto. You can see the striker and its spring down in there. The sear is located right there. When I pull the trigger, you can see the sear drop. One of Warner's claims to fame was that their safety actually blocked the sear and not just the trigger, which, okay, that's a good idea. Although it also had some unfortunate unintended consequences. Namely, if you had the safety engaged, you couldn't cycle the bolt. You could pull it back partway, but then it would jam on the sear. And inevitably, people would just figure that it needed the application of more force. And if you pull this thing hard enough with the safety on to actually cycle the bolt, you'll bend and deform the sear. And so Warner had to include in some of their documentation a specific warning not to do that. That's the unintended consequence of their nice sear blocking safety. The later pattern of the gun retained the exact same mechanical system, but did have a few stylistic changes. So you can see that the curvature of the rear frame changes to pretty much straight. The grip panels change. Once they run out of old 1908 pattern grip panels, they make new grip panels. And just you can see the shape of the frame up here changes slightly, as does the profile of this rib with the front sight. So those are pretty much all just cosmetic manufacturing process changes. They don't affect how the guns actually work. Serial numbers for these are located on the bottom of the grip behind the magazine. So there's what they look like to cycle. Really, honestly, a little bit of an unpleasant gun to cycle. It feels like you really have to force it to get the bolt all the way open. All right, and last thing I will point out here is they had the little logo here on the grip, making sure to get across the point that the safety blocks the sear. They're very proud of that. And then that center logo is a D, W, A, and C all intertwined together for Davis Warner Arms Company, or Arms Corporation. A total of about 7,600 of these pistols were manufactured, all here in the US, so most of the surviving ones are still here in the US. And they're kind of like the ugly sibling of some of what we would consider the more classic .32 caliber pocket pistols of that era, the Remington Model 51 and the Colt Model 1903 and the Savage automatic pistols. This is from the exact same time period as those, and it's the cool oddball that, you know, this failed commercially because, let's be honest, it's way too heavy, it's bulky, it's awkward to handle, and it does have this potentially serious safety problem of, you know, maybe accidentally blowing the bolt back into your face. So it's understandable why they didn't become a commercial success. But they're still a really interesting piece from a collector's point of view. In many ways, it's more interesting to look at the failed designs than the successful ones, because you'll often learn more from the failed designs. Anyway, it was very cool to be able to see two of these, an early model and a late model, side by side. If you'd like to add, well, in this case, if you'd like to add both of them to your collection yourself, these are actually part of a single lot of handguns here at Rock Island. If you take a look at the description text below, you'll find a link to the catalog page for this lot, and you can take a look at the pictures and the price estimate and everything for these two, along with the couple of other pistols that are batched with them. So, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.